Hello, what is good? This is going to be an Assassination Rogue tips and tricks video. You can think of this as a follow-up to the previous video I made, so if there's anything in here that I don't cover, check that one out. There's a good chance I answered it there, but if you don't find that, you can always drop a comment if you have any questions. But without further ado, let's get into it. So first thing I want to cover here has to do with the way we target things as Assassination Rogue. Being able to quickly and accurately swap your target is a big part of playing the spec well, but it's also a big pain point because when the pulls start to exceed 10 plus mobs, all of a sudden just using your mouse to click on nameplates becomes increasingly difficult, as the nameplates will tend to stack to the top of your screen, they'll overlap, it's difficult to navigate back to your PRIO target, so on and so forth. So one trick you can utilize to make that process a bit smoother involves using Shift Tab. So as an example, if I go into a pool here, assume there are more than 10 mobs here, so I'm incentivized to want to apply bleeds to unique mobs. I'm going to go into this pool, ambush, garrote, rupture, tab once, this target has bleeds, I don't care, tab again, this one doesn't have a rupture, I'm going to apply my rupture. And let's say I want to go back to my PRIO target. Because I press tab twice, if I shift tab twice, it will take me back to the target I first started the pull with, which in this case is my PRIO target. So you can use this as a quick and easy way to apply your bleeds and then get back to your PRIO target. If you're talented into subterfuge, your first global in a dungeon does not have to be ambush. What do I mean by that? Well, with subterfuge, you get access to your stealth abilities for 6 seconds after exiting stealth, assuming you have 2 talent points invested. What this can entail, and often on bigger pulls, is that you can start the pull by applying your bleeds before then moving to wherever your PRIO target is and ambushing it. A good example of that, I think, is the first pull in Necrotic Wake. I'll showcase that here. So in this case, I'm going to apply my bleeds to the soldiers. And then because I have my subterfuge window, I can ambush the gatekeeper, apply my Deathstalker's mark, before applying bleeds once more and going into my cooldowns. This can be a pretty useful tool to help accelerate your opener. Just be cautious to apply your ambush within that 6-second window, otherwise you'll have to invest a vanish to get it out. Okay, going into a pool of 10 plus mobs. How many times is it correct to press garrote and rupture in our opener? What I think is generally understood by people that play Assassination Rogue is we want to press rupture at least twice in our indiscriminate carnage window. This guarantees we'll apply 5 ruptures to unique mobs, which grants us our 20 stacks of Scent of Blood. And during that process, we're probably going to apply 1 or 2 garrotes. So that gives us plenty of bleeds and plenty of energy for the pull. We have our maximum main stat, we're good to go into our cooldowns, right? Well, not exactly. It turns out it is actually good spending the full time of your indiscriminate carnage window applying bleeds to unique mobs, so your ruptures and garrotes. But there are 2 conditionals that need to be satisfied. The first is, does the time you spend applying these bleeds mean that you don't have to reapply them later in the pull? So for example, let's say you apply the minimum amount of bleeds, right? You throw 2 ruptures, 1 garrote out, and then you go into your cooldowns. Once your PRIO target dies, if you then have to swap to a mob that doesn't have a bleed on it, so there's no rupture, you have to invest that time to apply a rupture, and doing so is a waste, right? You are better off applying that rupture in the opener when that was a more efficient global. Another way you can think about it is, are the garrotes and ruptures you're applying meaningful, right? If the additional garrotes and ruptures you're putting out past the 5 or 6 you do initially are on what I'll call shitter mobs, right? So in this case, in the City of Threads, they would be the constricts. Well, that's not going to be super valuable because they're going to be the first things to die. And those mobs also aren't what gatekeep you from advancing to the next pull. They're the webmancers, they're the marauders, they're the pursuers, the mobs that will live the longest. These are the mobs that are worthwhile applying bleeds to initially, as they're what will gatekeep you from advancing to the next pack. So that's the first conditional. The second conditional is, does the time you spend now applying bleeds push back your cooldowns such that you lose a cooldown use over the course of the entire key? Because if the answer is yes, then it's not worth doing. Now, in a coordinated group, oftentimes you can plan out your pulls and you have a pretty good idea of what the answer to that question will be. But when you're pugging, there are a lot of variables that come into play. How quickly is your tank going to pull? How much damage does your group have? Are we going to die and wipe on a pack, so we'll have to spend more time on it than we otherwise anticipate? All these things kind of add up, such that when you are pugging, don't spend more time applying bleeds than is absolutely necessary. It is a bigger net damage gain using your cooldowns on cooldown. And this transitions pretty well to the next point I want to make, which is to use your Kingsbane on cooldown, and specifically your 1 minute Kingsbane. Now, oftentimes when I was first playing Assassination Rogue, I kind of viewed each Kingsbane press as being distinct to its own pull. So I would either commit my Deathmark in Kingsbane if Deathmark was up, or I would commit just my Kingsbane to one pack. And then I would hold, my 2 minutes or my 1 minute until I got to the next pull. The problem regarding our damage breakdown is we do a lot more damage in our Deathmarked Kingsbane than we do our regular Kingsbane. So as a general rule, holding your Kingsbane and then potentially delaying your Deathmark Kingsbane is not a good thing to do. Watching this back, this is kind of hard to understand. What I'm trying to say is that if you don't use your non-Deathmarked Kingsbane on cooldown, this will desync your Deathmark from your Kingsbane, such that your Deathmark comes off cooldown earlier than your Kingsbane. This is bad because if Deathmark is up and you don't have your Kingsbane to pair with it, you can't send your Deathmark, right? Your Deathmark buffs your Kingsbane, and using them together is where you get your big 2 minute burst. This means you end up sitting on your Deathmark until Kingsbane comes off cooldown, and do this enough times over the course of an entire key, and you lose 2 minute presses, which results in lower damage throughout the key. But anyways, back to the video. And I think one dungeon that showcases that quite well, or where it's very easy to fall victim to the pitfall of holding your Kingsbane for new pulls, is in the Dawnbreaker. Like you can see in this instance, Kingsbane had just come up, my 1 minute Kingsbane, and I end up sending it into the Tactician here. Because what could end up happening, and as a consequence, so I'll just fast forward here in this pull, had I held my Kingsbane, we'd be going into this pull where my Deathmark's 15 seconds away, and I have my Kingsbane ready, but at that point, I'm better off just waiting for my Deathmark to come up anyways, because of how much more value that provides my Kingsbane with. So, had I held my Kingsbane, I would have had to hold it for the Deathmark anyways, at which point I just lose a Kingsbane press. So even though if we go back here, me pressing Kingsbane here, it's not great. Like I'm not getting a whole lot of value out of it, but I'm getting more than I would have had I tried holding it for the next pack. Along the line of thought of our cooldowns, Kingsbane has a hidden cap. Now in Dragonflight, this used to be 100 stacks. What that implied is that each time you dealt poison damage to your Kingsbane target, it would accumulate stacks, capping at 100, at which point your Kingsbane would be doing 1000% increased damage. Back when this was a thing, it was really hard to reach this number. You could pretty much only reliably get there with Lust and PI. And this is part of the reason why PI was so good for rogues back in Dragonflight. It's because it took so many poison applications to ramp your Kingsbane fully. In the War Within, Kingsbane was changed such that instead of capping at 100 stacks, it now caps at 50, which at first glance seems like a nerf, but the 50 stacks now is equal to 1000% increased damage. So it's actually the same as it was in Dragonflight, it's just a lot easier to ramp those stacks. As such, and what ends up happening, I'll demo this, is when you press Deathmark and Kingsbane, you actually hit max stacks relatively quickly. Especially if you have things like Twist the Knife. This further increases the rate at which you can apply your poisons, because Envenom overlapping twice means your poison application chance is very high. So if I just do my opener and cooldown rotation here, you'll be able to see pretty quick what that looks like. And we're max stacks at 6 seconds remaining on the dot. So at this point, any additional damage I do onto my target has no further interaction with Kingsbane. Okay, so that's cool and all, but why is this relevant? Well, what's interesting, because the Kingsbane cap is so easy to hit within our death marked window, once we've hit it, you don't necessarily need to keep hitting off that same mob. For instance, if you're not playing Subterfuge, so you only have 6 seconds of indiscriminate carnage, but you are playing Master Assassin, so you want to vanish in the last 6 seconds of your death-marked Kingsbane, rather than use that time after pressing Vanish to just send more Envenoms into your death-marked mob, you can instead utilize that time to reapply your garrotes and ruptures. And it's not like you're losing any potential Kingsbane damage because you've already ramped it up to max stacks. So again, what does that look like? It can look something like this. Let's assume we're playing no Subterfuge, but we do have Master Assassin, so ideally we vanish towards the end of our death-marked Kingsbane. Okay, I'm gonna go in, apply my bleeds, treat this like a pool of 5 mobs. Okay, I'm going to vanish here in the last. Now notice how I max stacks? I can instead apply some bleeds and my Kingsbane will still tick out the rest of its duration. The important thing, however, is that I need to ensure that my caustic spatter will last longer than the duration of the Kingsbane. If at any point during that process, your caustic spatter falls off before your Kingsbane expires, you will lose a substantial amount of damage. Now additionally, regarding Kingsbane stacks, as I mentioned with your Deathmark, you hit max stacks very quickly. Without Deathmark, it's not that easy to do. Yo, editing shenanigans here. I had to voice over this section because I go on to make a point about how if you pool energy before going into your Kingsbane, it will then lead to higher Kingsbane stacks because you're able to invest more energy into the Kingsbane. And while that's true, the conclusion I then make is that increases your single target damage, but it turns out, while yes, you will have higher stacks of KB if you pool energy in single target, that doesn't translate to doing more damage. So whether or not you pool energy going into your Kingsbane window doesn't really matter. You see, in this case, I get up to 38 stacks, all right? That's getting to around 40 in single target is pretty good. Sometimes you can get higher, sometimes you get lower. It really just depends on RNG with procs and also how much energy you have to invest into your target. Now in AoE on the other hand, it's a little bit easier to ramp your single stack in Kingsbane because you have so much more energy to work with. So I'll showcase that here. Apply all my bleeds. I'm going to Envenom. I'm just going to use my 1 minute Kingsbane here and we'll compare the difference, right? And I'm able to get up to 50 stacks at about 2 seconds remaining. So you can see the difference when you have energy versus when you don't. You know, having a surplus of energy versus not, you're able to more quickly ramp your stacks of Kingsbane. As an Assassination Rogue, you have big funnel, okay? Big PRIO dam. Whenever you can pull adds onto a boss or mobs onto a PRIO target, you are going to accelerate. Now, what do I mean by that? There are 3 notable talents I want to discuss. The first 2 I've touched on multiple times over the course of this video and my last guide. And those 2 are Scent of Blood, which gives you big main stat for each rupture you have out, and Venomous Wounds, causing your bleeds to give you energy back. With these 2 talents alone, you gain a lot of PRIO damage. On top of that, with the War Within, we've been introduced to a new 3rd talent, Singular Focus. The way this talent works is that all of your AoE, okay, all of your splash damage that is not on your PRIO target, 5% of that goes back into your PRIO target, all right? Now 5% may not sound like a lot, but If we use this Necrotic Wake first pull as a reference, right? This is a massive pull. We're probably talking 15 to 20 mobs that get pulled in here. Press Deathmark, press Kingsbane, all of that Caustic, all of those bleeds that are going on the mobs that aren't the Gatekeeper, 5% of that getting splashed into the Gatekeeper, we see the Gatekeeper melts. Okay, that's cool and all, but what does that actually look like in a log? So this is a 50 Necrotic, so not the same key as what I just showed you, but here is a damage snapshot from the first pull. I specifically tracked 20 to 38 seconds. My Kingsbane ends around 37 seconds here, somewhere in this window. So this is a window showcasing my most damaging abilities. And we can see that damage breakdown, with Caustic Spatter being by far my most damaging ability. And we can see everything else over here. So Singular Focus, you know, with 6% of my damage, it's really not that much. But if we look at the mob I'm hitting, which is the Gatekeeper in this case, we can see it does a fair amount of damage. In fact, it does almost double my next damaging ability in Envenom, which is kind of crazy. So in summary, Assassination Rogue, huge PRIO damage. Now what's interesting about Singular Focus is that it only gets applied to marked targets. So in other words, when you have a Darkest Night proc, you don't gain any benefit from Singular Focus because you need to spend your Darkest Night to apply Deathstalker's Mark. And so one gameplay element where that kind of comes into play and tying things into Raid for a change is on Ovanax. On this fight, there's an interesting interaction where as Assassination Rogue, you don't want your Darkest Night to be up when ads are spawning. And so this is something I'm actively thinking about when I'm fighting this boss. I want to spend it right as ads are going to spawn, and then get all my AoE out on those ads while my Deathstalker's Mark is up, such that during this interval, I'm getting the benefit from Singular Focus. Now, because you go through finishers so quickly in AoE, you're not going to like, eventually you will farm back another Darkest Night, and you're not going to sit there and just not use a finisher so you can sit with your mark on the target, right? You're better off just continuing to cycle through your hero talents, but it is something you can think about, and it's kind of like a fun minigame you can play to try and further optimize your boss or your PRIO target damage.
So there's a bug in the game that you should be aware of, and it has to do with your hero talent, Corrupt the Blood. The way the bug works is when you apply Rupture to a hostile entity that has its state of hostility changed, either because the entity you ruptured is no longer targetable but still exists, think of the third boss in Grim Batul, or maybe the hostile mob gets mind controlled, so it then becomes friendly. If, while your Rupture is active, you then target another hostile mob, your Corrupt the Blood will then trigger on the mob you have targeted. This can lead to some rather unfortunate butt pulling, so do be mindful of this. Now, there aren't many circumstances where this will ever occur, but one, and probably the most common situation, would be the third boss in Grim Batul, especially if you're doing that lava bender skip. During the boss fight, after the little dude jumps down, do not target the two lava benders that you skipped to get there. And the final point I want to get to in this video is that it is okay to remove crippling poison if the situation calls for it. Now, I say this fully understanding that yes, removing your crippling poison will make it so that your lethal dose gives you less damage. However, there also exist situations where allowing mobs to group more quickly gives your team more damage. So while you as an individual player may lose damage over the course of the pull, if it means the pull dies faster, it's a net gain. And in MYTHIC Plus, beating the timer is the most important thing. Now, a good example here that I can think of is in the first area in Arakara. Often during the spider section, I'm going to pause the video here, we're just about to go into the second mini boss, and there's a bunch of big gather pulls that we do. Our tank likes to grab all these ads and pull them into the mini boss. So what I'm going to do here is unclick my crippling poison, so I can then start to apply my bleeds ahead of time before we go into the mini boss, such that I can get into my cooldowns and ramp quicker once we engage knocked, which we do here. And because now if the mobs were slowed, they would take longer to get in here, they would take longer to die, they pose more of a threat. That's a problem, right? So clicking off my crippling poison here is a good thing to do. Further, I'm going to fast forward here. I think this next pull is a very good pull to take crippling off, because there again are several mobs that need to gather onto the mini boss, but there's also a caster that needs to get kicked in. And if you apply crippling poison to that caster, it's going to require that many more kicks to eventually fully make its way to the mini boss. So yes, you yourself may lose damage, but there also exist pulls where it may be better for you to remove crippling. And so if that's something that gets requested, or if that's something you can do to improve the quality of life of your dungeon experience, I would say go for it. So don't feel like you need to have crippling on 24/7. It is okay to remove from time to time and then just throw it back on whenever you no longer need to worry about it. I will say a downside for taking crippling poison off is if you forget to put it back on. This is a good boss for crippling poison, but I forget about it, so I think I apply it halfway through. Never mind, I don't. I just forget for the entire dungeon. All good, let's not worry about that. But that's it. That's everything I wanted to cover. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.